Good morning, everyone, or should I say, Joe-san. My name is the Reverend Jane Dicker, and I'm Vicar of All Saints with St Mary Magdalene in West Bromwich. Today, I want to share with you about the life and faith of Christians in the persecuted Church of China. There's going to be 4 sections on this with some reflective questions as we go along. I'm not going to provide all the answers. And at the end of each section, I'd like you to just have a little think about each of these questions. A list of resources, the reflective questions, and my email address so that you can email me any questions or thoughts. They're going to appear in the Space for Learning on the Lichfield website. So my first section, why did I pick this topic? When Bishop Michael first asked me to take part in this time of learning together, it came when I was thinking about the persecuted church in China. As some of you may know, I spent 15 years of my life living in Hong Kong, and during that time I visited South China and Beijing. But it wasn't really my history as such that brought me to this point. It came when I was suffering from a rare moment of self-pity. I'd been shielding for 7 weeks and had felt quite shut in at that moment in time. But then I thought to myself, think about all those people in the persecuted church in China and how shut in they are, and how so often people are under arrest for 15, 20 or 30 years. Clergy quite often are imprisoned in a cycle of arrest, isolation, torture, and then release. How can you have an effective ministry and a sustainable one amid such disruption? This is our first reflective point. We have to consider the possibility that as a church we're going to come back on the 4th, 5th of July, but then in the weeks to come that we'll be asked to close again. And so the cycle will be repeated. How are we going to manage that? And most importantly, how are we going to help our parishioners to go through such a scenario? So my second section is about understanding the context. To begin to understand a people and their culture, it's very important for us to understand their history. So this section will provide some sort of thoughts about some of the important moments in Chinese history. But of course, it wouldn't be possible to do this justice. It's such a rich and vibrant history of dynasties and emperors, and you can't possibly cover that in a short presentation. There's been a documented Christian presence in China since the 5th century and flourishing communities of Christians since the 7th century. Throughout Chinese history, there have been times of persecution, but the worst crimes against Christians have happened from the 19th century onwards in a more systematic way, because both nationalism and communism labelled all religions as cults that divided people's loyalties away from the state. And of course, the church was seen as one of the worst of those, with Christianity and that feeling of allegiance to an entirely different leader. And Christianity and our principles were seen as ways of undermining the law as well as the state of China. 1949 was an extremely significant date in Chinese history. Having just endured the Second World War, there's now a massive civil war and millions of Chinese people were to lose their lives. Missionaries were expelled from China, but this in itself created a new local Chinese church. There became a local hierarchy of Christian leadership, which in turn attracted more Chinese to join the church. From this time onwards, we see a dramatic growth in numbers of Christians in China despite the persecution, or maybe because of it. Chinese Christian history proves Tertullian's statement correct when he stated that martyrdom is the seed of Christianity. Theologically, Chinese history is made up of series of events of exodus and exile, deliverance and enslavement, fall and salvation. Chinese theologians return to their Bibles and read it in the light and delight of their history. So our reflection questions are: what does our history tell us about being English British Christians? Can we see a path or journey that has led us to this moment in time? And what theological principles have undergirded that process? Again, for you to be reflective, and I'd be delighted to share in conversations over that. In this third section, entitled Living the Dream, Surviving the Nightmare, I want us to think about what life is like in China and consider how they live in community with a church that's on permanent lockdown. China has two churches. It has an above-ground church, which is called the Three Self Church. It's state-sanctioned, and there's huge pressure from the government to join this recognised body. The Anglican Church, as we know it, has been recognised since the 1980s. And it was during this period that I visited Beijing. In fact, relaxation of worship and the ringing of church bells had just happened. And I discovered that at Easter, 5,000 people had been baptised into the church. Truly biblical numbers. The official number of Catholics at that time stood at around 70,000. But this is thought to be only about a third of the true number, because the underground church, the second church, is not counted within these statistics. Today it's believed that there are over 60 million Christians in China, across all settings, with some having global links. House churches have been the most resistant to joining the Three Self Church, and both leaders and worshippers have suffered frequent visits from the police, and they've lost their homes and their jobs. It's got so bad over the past 2 years that most services are now held online, rather than in a building, which of course can be targeted. Services are encrypted for protection, and celebrations for the new year, well, they were held online, and many churches had around 300 people joining in. Safe. The house churches also are not allowed to have minors attending, and they're not allowed any youth ministry whatsoever. They also have their crosses removed and are told that they have to sing patriotic songs instead of hymns. In the past year in China, a correct version of the Bible has been produced. It's a new state translation. It's now no longer possible to buy a Bible online. We are again seeing religious leaders being imprisoned under the charge inciting subversion. It carries a sentence of 15 years imprisonment. Prisons in China are cramped, hot, and hideous places. So how do you survive the nightmare and build community in the most unlikely of places? These are some of the survival tactics that are used, and in fact they're ones that we've been encouraged to use during our time of lockdown. Keeping a daily routine, saying familiar prayers such as the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm, In both China and Hong Kong, the Book of Common Prayer is extremely well known and very popular. It's their go-to book of faith after the Bible. Some other things that are important. Having a firm belief that people are praying for you as you too are praying for them, and having the faith that release will come soon. Not allowing yourself to be overwhelmed by pessimistic propaganda. And then very occasionally seeing that something miraculous can happen. One Chinese priest who'd been in prison for 24 years with no contact from the outside world received a message from a parishioner telling him not to give up hope, and that as far as they were concerned, he was still their parish priest, still a very important part of their community. That priest had believed that his people thought he was dead, but here was positive proof that they believed him to be alive and were praying for him. Just try and imagine that sheer delight and joy. Faith also comes in the most unlikely of places and is inspirational for the survival of the church and community. There's the Communist Party member who has a statue of Mary in his living room and describes faith as a healthy human expression. And that is a cause for hope. Now, what's kept you going through this time of lockdown? Have you gone back to familiar prayers? For me, I found both the prayers of St. Benedict and St. Francis to be important in keeping me sane, as well as all those normal ones that we say at the Eucharist, like the Creed and the Gloria. And how have you felt and continue to be a part of your community? Have you had a telephone ministry? Have you been Zooming, live streaming, emails? 2 weeks ago, I received a card from a parishioner sending me a prayer. She was one of the very first people in our community to have COVID-19. You can imagine my delight and my joy on receiving that card. What new theological insights have you discovered during this time, and what have you learnt about yourself? I've seen it as another part of my journey of waiting and using the waiting constructively to learn new things, to rediscover talents and enjoyments that have been lost or put on the back burner. My final points before I move on to resources are about the impact that persecution and imprisonment have had on Chinese theology and the community. Poetry has been a significant way of sharing experiences, and I'd like to read to you a poem entitled Believe in Life. While I'm imprisoned in a cage of pitch darkness, still able to endure the pain from torture, I will struggle to rise up, bite open my fingers, and with my blood right on the wall, believe in life. After I've gone through all hardships of life, dying at dawn surrounded by my posterity, I will summon my last breath with all my strength, crying as loudly and as clearly as I can, believe in life. If the earth goes round and round without ceasing, if history has a new journey to make, if my children and grandchildren go on living, then I believe in the future, believe in life. So as well as poetry, and I think that's a grand poem, hymns have also been an expression of amazing theology. Now, I wouldn't have the faintest idea how you would sing this, and with my voice, you wouldn't want me to be singing it, but I'm going to read this hymn to you. gazing at the shining stars from the abyss of pitch darkness, looking for a resting place for the spirit in a vast desert, listening to the silent conversations of all that exists on this small earth, coming to grips with oneself in the infinite passage of time. This is faith, the purest in human life. Faith is there at the end of all searching. Faith begins when this transient life merges with eternal life. You can see from both the poem and the hymn this absolute belief in the future and that constant looking forward from today. But the other big impact that's been had on Christian theology and through Christian theology in China is history, and finding times to actually be able to decode history when there's less persecution going on. The Chinese in very ancient times saw the meaning of history in terms of the will of heaven. That's the terminology, the will of heaven. And they evaluate success or failure of a dynasty in how much they've carried out the will of heaven. Well, if we applied that to our own history. Finally, for the Chinese, faith breeds faith. It's faith that keeps you alive in the tomb of prison. It's faith that rescues your yesterday and gives you your today. Faith means you have to be prepared that you may not be free to create your tomorrow. You have to have that trust. So what is the church in China, Chung Hoi Shung Gung Hoi, going to have to face in their tomorrow? From 2018 to 22, the government is promoting Christianity by thought reform. This covers the Bible, church teachings, and history. Just imagine what it means by thought reform. Last Christmas saw several areas in China being banned from celebrating at all. Most shockingly, during this pandemic, Christians have been discriminated against from receiving essential resources. And there is a concern that once a vaccine has been discovered, Christians may well be excluded, or at very least at the back of the queue. Real fears, true fears from a persecuted church. So to finish, keep them in your prayers. What they're going through every day and every year is incredible. And to keep that joy and delight in their trust in God is surely an example for all of us to follow. So some of the resources that I've used, well, I'm going to have a go at this. I do this sometimes when I'm doing services online, but I'm going to hold up the book. So I hope you can see this, but it's Theology from the Womb of Asia. As I say, it is on the website. So, and then I've used the Shen Gong Hui, Historical Studies of Anglican Christianity in China. 4 of these books have been produced. And one of the latest ones is entitled Christian Encounters with Chinese Culture. Very good book. So you'll find everything else, all the resources on the website. If you want to email me with any questions, please do so. My email address is mthr_jane@btinternet.com. And again, this is on the resources page in the space for learning. So it's been great to be able to share this time with you. So I'll say goodbye now, or as we would do in China, 再见.